It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. It's a history book. It's a biography. It's non-fiction, but it can read a little bit like a novel, I suppose. Except that while the story has the emotional drive of a novel, and I suppose the letters allow us into the emotional inner world of these two characters, Lev and Svetlana, ever so often, just as you're thinking, oh, this reads like a novel, you're reminded it's not, by a letter, and it's fact. There's nothing in the book that's made up. Everything is verified and has a footnote. But it's a tremendously emotional story about love. It's a love story about two people separated by the Gulag over a period of 10 years, and 4 years previously to that by the Second World War. But they kept their love alive through this extraordinary correspondence, smuggled in and out of a labour camp. Not going through the censors, smuggled in and out.
To make it clear, you composed the book out of...
Out of letters. Yeah. I was presented with this archive of, as it turned out in the end, 1,246 letters, both sides of a correspondence over an 8.5-year period, an extraordinarily unusual thing to survive, because prisoners keep letters, they cherish them, but very few people keep letters from a prisoner. They're dangerous. But in this case, we have a complete run of letters from both sides of the correspondence over 8.5 years, which were presented as part of a big family archives memorial, the human rights organization in Moscow, where I discovered them in 2007.
How come you discovered them?
I was making a radio program about a previous book I'd written in collaboration with Memorial for the BBC.
And Memorial is?
Is a human rights organization established in the late 1980s, which for 20 years has collected archives from people and taken interviews from people who in turn they've helped to find out their history, often from KGB archives, or trace people who've disappeared, relatives they don't know anything about. So they've built up a long relationship with survivors of victims of repression. And this archive of Lev and Svetlana Mishenko was the largest archive they'd ever been presented with. 3 huge trunks, which I literally stumbled on because they were in the doorway to the main office at Memorial in Moscow.
And they had given them to...
Lev and Svetlana, then in their 90s, had given them to Memorial. They were reluctant, but they'd been persuaded by the researchers at Memorial that the letters, which they'd just seen as private treasures, actually had tremendous historical significance. And Lev had been writing his memoirs about his war years before the Gulag, when he was in various German concentration camps. And so he'd been thinking about his life probably a little bit more and had come to realize that these letters were of historical interest and gave them to Memorial. I was then approached and helped them I raised the money for them to make transcriptions of the letters, because although they were uncensored, having been smuggled in and out of a camp, they were in tiny handwriting so they could get more on the page. People's identities were concealed by initials. They used a lot of euphemisms. A lot of the meaning was in between the lines. So we needed a transcription so that we could work on them to unpack the meanings. And at that stage, Lev and Svetlana in 2007 was still alive. So I went back to Moscow in 2008 with a little crew from the BBC in the hope that we could get a documentary film together that would finance the transcription of the letters quickly, so that we could then go to Lev and Svetlana to ask them about the correspondence before it was too late. They were 92 by this stage. Unfortunately, they passed away, but we did manage, before the transcription of the interviews, of the letters, to do some interviews with them.
And you did some shooting?
We did. We got
on video.
3 days of film of Lev and Svetlana talking about their story. And then 2 years later, by which time they both died, unfortunately, we had the full transcription of the letters. And this is the basis of, as it is in English, Just Send Me Word. And in addition to that, I mean, the letters are extraordinary for the size of the correspondence, the fact that we have two sides of the correspondence, the fact that they are uncensored because they were smuggled in and out of the labour camp by people working in the camp who either lived there but had full civil rights because they were released prisoners, or were people coming in and out of the camp as specialists. So they were the people carrying the letters in and out. But at that stage, I didn't really know how exceptional these letters were. And it was only when I began to read them that I realized how extraordinary they are, both because they're beautifully written. Lev's a wonderful writer. He has a lot of time, obviously, on his hands. He's sitting in a power station as a technician running this, installation for the Gulag.
Doing forced labor. Doing
forced labor. He's a prisoner.
Can we go back to the historical context a little bit?
Yeah.
What happens? What happened to him?
Yeah, Lev and Svetlana met as students, physics students at Moscow University in 1935. They began a courtship and weren't married by 1941 when war broke out and Lev was rushed off to the front with a unit from Moscow University and was immediately captured by the Germans in the encirclement of Vyazma, west of Moscow. The Germans at first tried to recruit him as a spy to send him back to Moscow, and he refused. So he was taken off to a series of concentration camps in Germany, where he was forced to work as a translator. He had German, very educated man. At the end of the war, he runs away from Buchenwald on one of the death convoys coming out of Buchenwald in April 1945, and is liberated by the Americans, who tried to persuade him to go to America because he's a nuclear physicist. Lev says no, he wants to go back to Moscow. All he has there is Svetlana. He doesn't have family of his own.
And he wants to go back because of
her, because all he has is Moscow. He doesn't know whether Svetlana's still alive. He doesn't know anything about her, but he doesn't want to give up the chance that she may be still alive.
And does he know at that time know anything about the state the Soviet Union is in?
Well, he hasn't been there since 1941. He's not been able, obviously, to correspond with anyone in the Soviet Union. He doesn't know the dangers that await him. But he has nothing but Svetlana. All the people he cares about are in Moscow. He doesn't have family of his own. His parents have been executed by the Bolsheviks in 1919 during the Civil War. But he decides to go back to Moscow, so as soon as he's repatriated at Weimar in Soviet-occupied Germany, he's arrested, like lots of soldiers at that time coming back from occupied Europe. Put through what they call a filtration camp.
Why was he arrested?
Well, because anyone who'd not fought until death, anyone who'd allowed himself to be captured, who possibly deserted for all the Soviets knew, or ran over to the other side, was immediately suspicious. And these filtration camps, these prison camps that they put all returning soldiers through, were there to interrogate soldiers and to try and weed out any collaborators, spies, and so on. Lev had worked as a translator, so that did make him a collaborator, but he was tricked into signing a confession of espionage. He trusted his interrogating officer too much, and he was given a death sentence, immediately commuted to 10 years in Pechora, which was an important gulag, developed particularly during the war years because it was part of a gulag railway development up to the Vorkuta coal and oil deposits of the far north, which were essential for the Soviet military because they were an important fuel base. If the Germans had broken through Stalingrad, captured the southeast, the only fuel the Soviet Union would have been Vorkuta in the north. So it was an important, rather barbaric, very rapidly developed gulag system of the war years. And Lev was sent up there where he worked was put into a wood combine. They were floating timbers down from remote Arctic colonies, from forest colonies, and hauling the timbers up, drying them, and then in workshops manufacturing them into prefab housing for the Gulag, furniture for the Gulag, railway sleepers for the railways. Lev spent 3 months working in the hauling teams. Probably would have died if he'd worked much longer. It was exhausting work. But then was rescued by an extraordinary man, an old Bolshevik who was a prisoner but an important person in the administration and running the laboratory of the wood combine to experiment ways of speeding up the drying process. And he recognized in Lev a scientist. Lev was a physicist. And put him into the electric power station. It was a rather primitive power station to fuel the workshops and the wood combine. And Lev, in this way, was saved, became a relatively privileged prisoner, was warm, dry, and had time to write letters.
Because outside circumstances were awfully harsh.
He wouldn't have. You couldn't survive more than 6 months.
You could not.
No. In 1944 to 45, about a third of the prisoners in the wood combine died.
Okay. How many people are we?
There were about 1,500 prisoners and 500 free workers. The free workers were the key to the smuggling system. They were basically former prisoners who'd finished their sentence but had nowhere to go. Or the MVD, the KGB that was running the Gulag, made it worth their while to stay. So they were living inside the barbed wire zone or could come in and out of the zone. So Lev is in the electric power station. For the first time, he has the opportunity to write. He doesn't know anything about Svetlana. He doesn't know if she's still alive, if she's married, if she wants to hear from a prisoner. He had decided not to write to her, to give up. But something...
Because?
You know, by the time... when you're a prisoner, you give up on yourself. He didn't want to be a burden to her. He didn't want to impose himself on her. Hello, I'm your old boyfriend, and I'm
so many years.
After so many, and I'm in the Gulag. That's an imposition on somebody. So he didn't write to Svetlana in the end. He wrote to somebody he called Aunt Olya. She's not an aunt, she's a sort of distant relative. And asks after Svetlana. And a few weeks later, Svetlana writes to him. And it's like a miracle for him. And she's still alive, obviously. She's not married. She's been waiting for him. She's working in an industrial physics research institute. They're developing synthetic rubber for the tire industry, a really important industry for the Soviet-Union where you have these extremes of temperature. And it's for the military. So it's secret work, it's secret industrial work. So to correspond with a prisoner is risky for her. But, amazingly, the letters can be smuggled because of their free workers coming in and out of the camp. There are various ways in which the smuggling system worked, but one, for example, was through a photographer. So one of the amazing things about this archive, we have all these photographs of prisoners inside the camp, which is almost unheard of. There was a photographer who was a free worker. He was working on the railway and doing repair jobs inside the zone. His name was Lev Izrailovich. Svetlana from Moscow would send a parcel with photographic materials for him and letters for Lev. And Lev Izrailovich, the photographer, would put the letter in his jacket, take it to Lev at the power station, and also give him money for the photographic materials. In this way, Svetlana could get to Lev not just letters, uncensored, but money, which otherwise would have been stolen by him from the guards. And then Lev Izrailovich would take letters out. And this smuggling system worked like that. So it was still a huge risk for her to be corresponding with him, but they could, as they did, increasingly open up. Lev begins to write, at first he's very cautious about what he writes, so he wants to protect her from knowing everything about the camp. He doesn't want to alarm her about his conditions, He says, oh, it's okay, the food's okay, but actually we know it's not. But eventually, he begins to open up and writes in a very interesting way about, the sort of what daily life is like in the camp. Actually, in all probability, his letters are the only major real-time record of daily life in the Gulag.
And that's where this book, this correspondence differs from, for instance,
Solzhenitsyn or any other memoir of the camp. There are lots of memoirs. I mean, it's not to... I mean, these are great works of literature in many cases, but they are written.
But this is
with
real
memory.
time. This is real time.
Real time.
Everyday life.
Every day. This is happening now. So you get a very strong sense of what his anxieties and fears are. Towards the end of the correspondence, it goes on for 8.5 years, you get a very strong sense of the psychological burden on Lev. The sort of... it's very hard to watch people degenerate. Friends that he develops close relationships with in the camp, and they're living in cooped-up barracks all those years. And some friends, people go mad, people become brutal. So all sorts of things happen that alarm you because they destabilize your own identity. You think, what's happening to me? But all this time, Svetlana is, in a sense, sustaining him. She's sustaining him morally. She's giving him hope. That's the main thing she's giving him. She's giving him hope that, he'll be released, and when he's released, they can start a life together. So he's living for that.
But at the same time, there was this constant fear, I guess, to be sent...
Yeah, that to be sent away is the biggest fear, actually.
To circumstances that were much harsher.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's difficult for us perhaps to appreciate what a convoy means, but that's, I think, after the fear of falling ill, because medicines were, there weren't many medicines. After that, the fear of being sent away in a convoy is Lev's greatest anxiety, because what does that mean? It means, he was in colony number 2 for political prisoners. He would first be sent to colony 3, which is like a penal colony in a separate part of the labour camp. And that was mainly inhabited by criminals. And criminals are brutal. They can rape you. They can kill you without much fear of punishment. And then it means being sent to either a stone quarry, a pit, or a forest colony where you're cutting down trees. And there, getting there, firstly, you'll lose everything. The guards will steal all your possessions. And when you're there, if you die, no one's going to know. If the guards kill you, no one's going to know.
Traveling by temperatures minus.
Yeah, minus 40 in the winter, if you're out there, unlucky enough to be out there in those temperatures, or in the summer, mosquitoes. The mosquitoes, they didn't need the barbed wire zone.
They didn't.
Menachem Begin, the Israeli president, was at Pechora before Lev. He said, anyone who tried to escape, they would just be eaten by the mosquitoes in the summer. And the only time you can escape is the summer. You can't escape in the winter, too cold. So, the fear of being sent away in the convoys is the physical hardships you're going to go through. But also for Lev, he will then lose all contact with Svetlana. That's his greatest fear. She won't know how to contact him. People just disappear. Because her correspondence is really what's keeping him going. She's keeping him going morally by, the love she shows in writing to him virtually every day, although obviously, it's only 2 or 3 letters he gets a week. And she's helping him materially because she's sending him vitamins, medicines, books, and she's helping his friends in the camp. So Strelkov, the man who saved him, by giving them the jog in the power station, he falls ill, and so Lev, who's very fond of Strelkov, is sending Svetlana symptoms. This is what's wrong with him. And she's going to her doctor friends, and they're saying, well, he's probably got this, and sending out the medicines. And this whole network of solidarity and friendship is developing between prisoners, and much of it going through Svetlana, their friends and relatives outside the zone. And that's really extraordinary. So in a sense, although the book is a love story about this particular relationship, which is extraordinary enough, I'd say in many ways it's actually a book about love in the broader sense, you know, the solidarity and the friendship that keeps people alive in those conditions.
Were these people intellectuals?
Yes and no. They weren't intellectuals in our Western sense, I don't think. They were both highly educated people, both scientists, both physicists by background. Lev came from a family of the Moscow gentry, which had, as I said, been wiped out in the Civil War, and had a grandmother who brought him up, who was, you know, religious Moscow type of the old gentry. Svetlana came from a slightly different family of the sort of Soviet and technical intelligentsia. Her father had been important in the development of the rubber industry, and her mother was a teacher. They're both scientists, but they're both highly cultivated, and they are both, as all Soviet scientists were, and to a large extent still are, very well read in literature. So they can talk a lot about poetry. A lot of their correspondence is about, you know, art and music and theatre and films and books. And Svetlana's feeding with information about what she's seeing and reading. And they're, to some extent, getting around potential pitfalls of, because there's always the danger that the letter will be caught by the guard. It's not being censored, but one of the smugglers could be arrested. And then there's the danger of, what are the guards going to read in the letter? Are they going to get into trouble for the correspondence? Is the smuggler going to get into trouble for the correspondence? So when they want to talk about things to do with the police or the Gulag, they use euphemisms. And Lev often talks about the idiocy, the stupidities of the Gulag system, or of the police running it. But he does so by referring to literature. He'll talk about Gogol, or he'll talk about Saltykov-Shchedrin, another sort of satirical writer of the 19th century. So they'll use literary allusions to get their meaning across. So in that sense, I suppose they're intellectuals.
And they were, I think, second generation communists.
Well, that's an interesting question, yeah.
Were they convinced?
Well, it's hard to answer that because there's not much of a political nature in the correspondence, which is interesting in itself. Lev was, in the 1930s, a fairly orthodox Komsomol member of the Communist Youth League, and went off to war in 1941, I think, you know, despite the Bolsheviks murdering his family, you know, a committed Soviet idealist. Svetlana probably much the same, but from their correspondence in the late 1940s and early 1950s, it's difficult to pick up much of a political nature. I mean, even when Stalin dies and they comment on it, there's not much political revelation. What can one say about their politics? You know, Svetlana was a senior researcher at this research institute in Moscow, and as such had to be a member of the party. It was part of her professional duties. Had to be a trade union member. Had to be a Soviet activist. You know, had to go on marches, attend political meetings, put through propaganda. So that's part of her sort of conscientiousness as a professional. To some extent, I think she believes in Soviet science, genuinely does, without questioning it. Although, at the same time, you can pick up in her correspondence a good deal of sarcasm about the sort of political jargon that get used, the sort of bureaucracy she's very critical of. When she talks about going on a march, you know, you get the impression it's all just a jolly day out. It's not about the political slogans. On in Lev's case, it's really interesting. You might think of it as a paradox, I suppose. You know, he's a prisoner.
As a paradox, you say?
Yeah, almost. He's a prisoner of the Gulag. And yet there are these letters where he's waxing lyrical about the virtues of what the Gulag is achieving elsewhere. So he writes about the Volga-Don Canal. Well, that was a Gulag project, and Lev knew it was a Gulag project. But he believes in, you know, technology and Soviet science even when it's being advanced by Gulag labor. So, you know, he's not shy about talking about the, you know, the idiocies of the Gulag. He has no illusions about what's being done to him. He knows it's an injustice. But, you know, to some extent, he accepts it, because what choice does he have? He's stoical. So you'd expect him to be hypercritical of the system. But he's not. He's not political. And I've often wondered about that, because, you know, there are moments, for example, there are several moments when Svetlana's trying to persuade him to appeal against his sentence. And you would have thought, well, okay, here, you know, she might have allowed the particular injustice she feels has been done against Lev to spill into a more general discussion about the injustices of the system as a whole. But she doesn't. So why doesn't she? And why doesn't he? You know, to some extent, as I say, he accepts his punishment. At the end, when the discussion is about his appeal, in the hope that he could then return on his release to scientific work, he says, no, why should I appeal? Because it was done to lots of people, this. Why single me out for an amnesty or special treatment?
Yeah, there even is a part in the book where he says it's been fair that he was...
Yeah, that's very interesting. He knows it's an injustice, but at the same time he says, precisely in this discussion in 1954, I think, just before his release, where he says, no, I don't want to appeal against my sentence, because he says, well, even if I wasn't guilty of espionage, I was guilty of translation. And that would give a sentence of 3 or 4 years. So, and that would be on my papers after my release, and that would make it hard for me to get a job. That will make it hard for me to return to Moscow, etc., etc., etc. So it's a sort of stoicism, it's a sort of acceptance of his guilt, even though at the same time he knows, I think he knows, he certainly knew later, and talked quite explicitly later about how unfair the system had been. But I think the reason why he doesn't allow himself, or Sveta doesn't allow it to be politicized for them to discuss it in terms of injustice, is that, and this is for me the most remarkable thing about his letters, there's not the slightest hint of bitterness or self-pity. You know, if he'd allowed himself to think a huge injustice has been done to me, political injustice, you know, you could easily see him succumbing to the weakness of self-pity, bitterness. And there were lots of people around him who did. But, you know, if he survives, if he's able to keep going and remain, and this is for me absolutely extraordinary, remain morally intact as he does. You know, I mean, obviously he's battered and bashed by the system, but he comes out of it still, you know, an amazingly intact human being. Authentic human, true human being. If he does that, it's largely because of Svetlana's love through these letters, but it's also because of the hope he has. And if he allowed himself to sort of get bitter and self-pitying, what would have happened to that hope? He would have given up, you know. So I think maybe there was an element of, you know, not allowing himself to think about the political system. Maybe it was naive. It's difficult to tell, because, you know, undoubtedly if he had lived a little bit longer and I had the chance to question him having read the letters, these would have been the sort of questions I would have wanted to ask. But, you know, as it is, I think we can only guess now.
And Love was released in 1945, I guess?
1955. July 1954.
54,
He had a
yes.
10-year sentence, but from about 1950 they introduced a system that if you over-fulfilled your norm under the plan, you could then earn yourself some time off your sentence. And so he served in the end 8.5 years and was released in July 1954. Like many prisoners, he was released with a minus, in other words, a list of towns he couldn't go back to, obviously Moscow being the main one. So he settled in a village between Moscow and Petersburg, Leningrad as it was then, and couldn't find a job. But Svetlana smuggled him into Moscow, and he would pick up translation work for a scientist friend who would sign off on it and give Lev the money. And then in 1955, he was given an amnesty. It was part of the Adenauer amnesty. Konrad Adenauer had negotiated an amnesty of Germans in the Gulag.
The former German president.
Exactly, with Khrushchev. And Khrushchev had reciprocated by releasing so-called collaborators, including Lev. So that allowed him to return to Moscow. He can then get residency rights, and it's only when he's got residency rights that he even thinks about marrying Svetlana. So they marry, which is, simply a question of registering Lev and Svetlana's man and wife and fellow residents of the same apartment. The young girl writing it down says to Svetlana, I wouldn't marry him if I were you because he's a former prisoner. Svetlana says, don't worry, just register him as my husband. And shortly afterwards, in 1956, at the age of 39, Svetlana has their first child, Anastasia, followed by Nikita in 1958. And Lev eventually is able to return to scientific work, not, unfortunately, to nuclear physics research, which he'd been engaged in before the war. Between 1941 and 1956, the world of nuclear physics has moved on a bit. But he is able to go back as a lab assistant to work at the Physics Research Institute of Moscow University, where he works for 34 years.
And were these people capable of leading a normal life?
I think they were. I mean, I think, obviously the Gulag left an imprint on their lives. Nikita, their son, whom I interviewed, and who wrote something for the end of the book about growing up in that family. I mean, obviously it's a very interesting question. What does it mean to grow up in a family with this sort of story? He says that there were many elements of the Gulag that left a trace on Lev. He was, for example, always worried about not having enough bread in the house, always going out for more bread. That sort of thing was there. But I think, as I said before, I think Lev did return, although, in many ways battered by the Gulag, he did return intact. And that's largely Svetlana's doing, that she kept him going all those years. And they lived what seems to be pretty much a very happy married life. And Nikita talks about Lev's love for her being something close to reverence. He was devoted to her. He really did teach his children that she was a heroine, which she was, and had saved him. Svetlana wasn't an easy person. She suffered from severe bouts of depression, which could make her moody, and it must have been difficult for the children. But this sort of almost the cult, I think, probably, of Svetlana in the family helped children give her, and make more allowances for her difficulties, insofar as they knew, they could see how much Lev was devoted to her. And he did everything in the house. He was very practical, devoted family man, devoted to Svetlana. So I think, it was an exceptional family. But it was, I mean, it's exceptional also in the sense that they told their children everything. Other prisoners, fellow prisoners have never returned and had families. They didn't tell their children, and that was the norm. They wanted to protect their children. Lev and Svetlana told their children everything, and so Nikita and Anastasia grew up thinking that what their parents had gone through was sort of normal. So I think they I mean, it wasn't entirely lived happily ever after, but I think given what they'd gone through, the love that they had, devotion that they had shown in those years of separation saw them through the rest of their lives.